Thank you again to the City of Toronto for presenting this session and the Ways and Means series. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Shasha Nakhai. Shasha is a Toronto-based storyteller with over a decade of experience. Her work has aired on BBC, CBC, ZDF, and Art, and is screened at the Museum of Modern Art. Her recent feature, Scarborough, based on the book by Catherine Hernandez, was TIFF's top 10 list and took home 4 Canadian Screen Awards this year, including Best Motion Picture. Next up is award-winning novelist and screenwriter Shyam Selvadurai. His novel Funny Boy was made into a film, for which Shyam co-wrote the screenplay and won the Canadian Screen Award and New York Cinema Independent Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Shyam's new novel, Mansion of Myth of the Moon, a historical novel about the Buddha's wife, was released in May 2022. Next is Paige Sisley, a literary agent at Cook McDermott. She represents upmarket and book club fiction, as well as nonfiction authors who are writing in the memoir, lifestyle, or health and wellness space. In addition to managing her own list, Paige is Cook McDermott's in-house film and TV agent. In this role, she coordinates screenwrites across the agency, works with co-agents, and represents clients' IP and creative services directly. We also have Jeff Young here today, joining us from the West Coast. Jeff is an entertainment media and sports lawyer with 35 years of experience. He's a member of the bars of British Columbia and California, and is a trademark agent in both Canada and the US who regularly works on film, television, and music deals. He is also certified as an NFT expert and is the current treasurer of the Screen Composers Guild of Canada, with composer credits on 3 feature-length films. And finally, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's session, Adnan Khan. Adnan is a writer whose essays in journalism have appeared in The Walrus, The Globe and Mail, and others. His debut novel is There Has to Be a Knife. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you for that, Rhiannon, and thank you guys all for joining. We've got a great talk today. One of the good things about today is that we have a real diverse panel of people from different experiences in the adaptation process, kind of ranging the spectrum of from screenwriting to the sort of nitty-gritty industry side. So please remember, throw in your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end. So just a good dig right in. Paige, I wanted to begin with you. Shasha and Shyam both have kind of atypical processes with the adaptation of Funny Boy and Scarborough. So I was hoping we could set the foundation by maybe going through what we would call a typical process. So maybe you can just walk us through what a typical adaptation process would be like, or what you might expect when everybody is neutral, nobody knows anybody, and you have a manuscript for a novel in hand.
Yeah, sure. Well, I laugh because I feel like there's probably no such thing as the typical path. I think every piece of IP is different. Every creative partnership is different. But that's really where it starts, is finding the right creative partners. At least that's what we feel is the most important in terms of the IP we represent. It's not always, the biggest deal. Obviously, optioning the film and TV rights is a great additional revenue stream for our authors. But you want to be able to trust that there's some sort of shared vision, or if not shared, that the author is comfortable with the filmmaker's vision and how they plan to adapt it. So it starts with that, just kind of, finding out how real the interest is, how serious. We like to receive an offer in writing, ideally before the creative conversation, just so that we know there's like a business foundation to jump off of from that point. But the creative conversation is really crucial, because that's when the author will be able to decide whether this is the right creative partner for them. And so if both parties want to proceed, then, we as the agency, either directly or in partnership with a film and TV co-agent, will negotiate the deal and the contract. And, obviously the contract is laying out clearly all of the various terms of the deal, so that everyone is clear on what rights are being granted, what, if any, involvement the author will have. So that's a conversation we usually have pretty early on with our authors to find out how interested they are in being involved, if at all. Some feel like this is not their medium and they just want to be able to hand it over to an expert who knows the film and TV world. And some really want to be involved just to have some kind of say as a consultant, or maybe even to gain experience as a screenwriter, which our authors are doing kind of increasingly. So we negotiate the contract, and then we kind of let the author and filmmaker or whoever the optioning party is build the relationship from there.
So typically in that process, I mean, we saw with, for example, Funny Boy was out for 2 decades or so before the movie kind of got going. And we know that some screenwriters took stabs at it. Scarborough was out for a much shorter period, a couple of years. There was a pre-existing relationship, and so that kind of moved things along. Typically, if a manuscript is coming out into the world cold, are you waiting for the manuscript to be published and then for sort of attention to be generated that way? Is it more of a proactive thing where, the author will say, hey, my vision for this novel is for it to be a film one day. I'd like to get going and poking around and seeing if there's film directors interested.
Yeah, I guess I can start us off there. Again, I would say, there's no like one way forward. I kind of think of there being multiple submission points for a book. So, when you have the final manuscript, or maybe when it publishes, tend to be, if there's buzz building before the book publishes, then you can kind of act on that preemptively. And I do think that creates really exciting opportunities for filmmakers. And I would love to hear from you, Shasha, about your ideal timing for receiving manuscripts. But, and then of course, when the book publishes, that's when there tends to be the most buzz about it kind of out in the world in a public facing way. And sometimes, it's a year after a book publishes, and maybe it's with the paperback, which is when it really breaks out and someone notable tweets about it, and then a filmmaker sees that tweet, and that can lead to relationships down the road too. So there are definitely clear submission points where you can kind of get ahead of it and hopefully help create buzz by maybe getting a film and TV option. But I also don't think that the window of opportunity is ever fully closed, because it really is, again, finding that right person who loves the book and wants to adapt it for the screen. And sometimes that just takes time and happenstance.
So Shyam, one of the interesting things about the book and the film compared to Scarborough, for example, was that, you've written about how there were a few screenwriters who took a couple cracks at it. Obviously your book was, I think, out for about 20, 25 years before it was adapted. Your book had sort of established you and established its own reputation. So walk me through that. Where did it go from, I've written this novel, I'm proud of my novel, I'm going to continue writing other novels. In the periphery, people are taking runs at this book. Was that something that you always had in mind, or was it, and then one day you were just like, what, it's time for me to step in this and just take over?
Well, I mean, the first thing that happened in terms of optioning was Gorinda Chadha, who saw me read actually from it at a South Asian festival here, and then she wanted to see the book, and then she wanted to know if I would adapt it with her. And I had a clue what I was doing, but they pay so much more than books. It's incredible. I mean, it's like shocking how much film pays compared to books. So I just said yes, of course. So I worked with Gorinda on it, and Channel 4 was the producer, or was the sponsor of it. And then it didn't work out. So I took the thing back, and it was clear to me why it wouldn't work out, because it's a novel in stories, and a lot of those stories are told about other people by the narrator, and that never works in film. So I understood right away that we should have just had the first story and the last story, which are about the protagonist, and just keep that as a novel, as a film. But anyways, then somebody else picked it up in LA, and they did get an award, Academy Award-winning screenwriter to work on it. And again, I was terribly disappointed because they kind of invented history, and it started off with everybody running to the airport to get on the last flight out. Like, obviously the writer had seen Miss Saigon. So I decided at that point that by then the book had kind of become a sort of classic in a way. I mean, and I felt that generation after generation of people reading it, and I should withdraw it completely from the market. So I did that. But then a Sri Lankan filmmaker said to me, why don't you just adapt it? Just do it. So I thought, well, I'm sort of in mid-career, I wouldn't mind a new way of writing. So I read Sid Field. The only reason I read Sid Field is because Ruth Prao-Jabwala, a very famous adapter, who's also a novelist, had said he guided her, his work guided her. And I just used Sid Field. I read a lot of screenplays and I did the adaptation. Then I showed it to my agent, Michael Levine, and Michael was shocked. I think he just couldn't understand that. He's like, oh, you have this talent. How interesting. Most novelists don't have this talent. And he said, who do you want to see it? Who would you like to see this screenplay? And I said, Deepa was one of my first choice, Deepa Mehta. And Deepa and I had already worked on a kind of radio play on based on one of the stories in Funny Boy. So I knew she loved the novel. And it was just the right moment in Deepa's career. And she said she wanted to do it. And then she worked with me through various drafts at that point. And we worked it for about 3 months. And then we sent it out and we got funding. But I mean, I don't want to sort of give the idea that I just came into it completely naively, because around the same time, I had been commissioned by the CBC to create a series. And the producer had put me in a relationship with this wonderful story editor, Meredith Vushnik. And Meredith really taught me a lot, like basic stuff like that you don't really know. That, like, don't say somebody's going to do something in one scene and have them do it in the next scene. Just like cut to the doing. And that's just something that the rhythm of that was very different from a novel, where you actually do have to say somebody's going to do something and then have them do it. And Meredith also taught me very clearly how to cut out of a scene and how to cut fast. And I'd already had a background in theater. So in adapting the dialogue, I knew how an actor would speak the lines. I knew that you had to be able to tell each actor for each line what is their intention. And so the scene had to have a kind of intent, like had to move through intention. And while the novel does that, the novel's dialogue is tied to the rhythm of the sentence. It's very different. It seems natural, but it's not natural until you speak it out loud. So I had to redo a lot of the dialogue for the adaptation. I could go on about it, but I think I'll stop there.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point about the adaptation process and what the literary qualities you may have to leave behind in order to adapt to a new medium. So, Shasha, I know that you had a prior relationship with Catherine. You'd worked on a dance documentary. And my understanding is that when you guys I'm not sure if she approached you or you guys just naturally found each other, but Catherine had an understanding of how she wanted the movie to be, right? You've spoken about how she wanted that documentary style, that intimacy that sort of replicated the prose. So I'm curious about like what that collaborative process is like when, you have another figure who has vested interest, obviously, in their own text. And there's this adaptation where, maybe you have a higher facility with film and with images, and what that collaboration is like and how it sort of is born from knowing each other and working with each other previously.
Yeah, for sure. I can, so the process of making Scarborough was, I would say, atypical just in how it came to be. My partner, Rich, and I knew Catherine for a long time. We're just members of like the Filipinx like arts community here. And 13 years ago, when Catherine was in theater, she was actually in the first like student doc I made. And then I would say 6 years ago, the Toronto Real Asian Film Festival partnered us together to work on a dance film. And I guess she just really liked working with my partner, Rich, and I. We didn't even think to ask to adapt Scarborough. We were hearing all these accolades and we were just really impressed. But Catherine sent us a copy of the book. And she said, I have a couple of production companies trying to option this, but I really liked the way that we worked together on the dance film. I like that you guys are documentarians, so you're really mindful about your impact. And she said, if I write the script, can we work on this together? And our first thought was like, we've never adapted a book before. I don't even know where you start. And, you know, we don't even know how to apply to telefilm, but we had one shot, which was through Telefilm's Talent to Watch program through Real Asian. And we said, okay, why don't you give us the rights for 1 year? We'll try to apply to this one shot that we have. And if it doesn't work, you know, you can have the rights back and you can take it to a bigger production company. So that was kind of how the project came to be, really. Yeah.
Okay,
and
so
I'm learning a lot more now about how filmmakers find projects. And, you know, there's so many different ways, like Paige was saying. Sometimes you can just read a book and then inquire yourself, like who owns the rights to it. But one of the things I'm learning now is that a lot of books, if they're of any caliber, even before they're published, they're usually bought by big production companies or big agencies. And I'm learning that more and more as I go along. So sometimes you might come to a work through a producer or a production company because they have a whole bunch of IP that they've amassed and they think you might be a possible fit for something they own. And then also sometimes if you have like an agent or a manager, they sometimes can pair you with a work. And then also I've learned that there's Ontario Creates has a Page to Screen event at TIFF every year. And so it's kind of like a speed dating between filmmaker producers and literary agents or publishers. So yeah, that's kind of like the route we took, but I'm learning these are all the so many very different ways that people can take to get IP.
okay, so kind of like an organic approach with both of them. So Jeff, walk me through this. Like, you know, you have these two situations where there's sort of an organic relationship. You know, Shyam had worked with Deepa, Shasha knew Catherine beforehand. So at what point does the lawyer start getting involved?
Well, the number one thing for me is that, you know, I get involved when a client or a potential client gives me a call and says, I'd like you involved. So on that note, Shyam, please say hi to Michael Levine. We've actually worked on 2 deals already this year. And I know his daughter, who's a film producer, very well as well, because she's out here in Vancouver. My world is really one where I generally represent production companies. I don't think this is my 35th year of practice in Canada. I'm over a decade in California. I'm with firms in both countries where we do exclusively entertainment law work these days. And I don't think I've gone a single month, probably in the last 10 years, where I haven't worked on at least one literary option agreement or a life rights option agreement or some format license agreement, that kind of thing. And each of these types of deals involve different rights. So the first thing that I would have to say is understand how to structure the deal that you want. You may want to be involved in writing, but because of your lack of background or extensive background as a writer for film, you're going to either get an opportunity or not, and you would have to decide where you want to fit in. From the point of view, if you are a production company, because I know some of our audiences, production companies, you've got to know what you're offering. Are you really looking at a deal that involves a person's life rights? Are you dealing with a work of fiction? What is going on involved in the deal points? I do have some notes on deal points we can dig into a little bit later if that's appropriate. But one of the areas, for example, that you've got to think about is to what extent has that literary work gone through some form of either a libel read or some kind of clearance process, because most writers don't think about that when they write something. They think it's just cool to write all sorts of great fiction. The book perhaps will get published or maybe it's self-published. But when you suddenly adapt it to screen, you have to worry about all sorts of things. There's been lawsuits in both countries dealing with stories that have shown up that deal with political issues, real life issues, and those will attract either the inability to secure clearances, errors and omissions insurance, and really important things that will turn your work into something that will make it on the big screen or even the medium-sized screens if you don't deal with these underlying legal issues. So one of the interesting things, if I'm representing a writer, is how far do we go in actually going through the book and ensuring that there aren't strong potential issues involved in these legal traps. Small thing, I do have an article online that talks about if you want to write a literary work or make a movie about somebody that's still alive and quite famous, but it's sort of in that interesting world of partial reality, partial fiction, like we've seen from movies like The Social Network and Bombshell. You've really got to start working with your legal counsel to make sure that the product you created will eventually make it on screen free of these issues. So that's sort of one of the things that I know I've had to work with writers in terms of their product.
So who's bringing you in? Is it the filmmaker that's bringing you in? Is it the studio? Is it the novelist? Is it the agency?
I get
Which
my
is
referrals from everywhere. For example,
so
I
you're on all
spoke at
sides of the coin. Okay.
yeah, I've represented all sides of the equation, but primarily I would say a number of my larger clients are mostly production companies who have a really good history of being very successful in adapting stories to screen. And so mostly I would say literary option agreements based on scripts or books. And life rights is a very common thing because I do a lot of work in the documentary world. One of my prouder shows that I worked on this year actually won 5 Leo Awards as a documentary. And then, of course, there's also outright just life right options agreements that you have to deal with when it's the subject, the person that the filmmaker is interested in. I'm curious, Paige, do you do life rights representation as well as literary option agreements?
Yeah, we have when it's nonfiction or memoir based on someone's life. Yeah.
Right. I know it's a little question. How early do you have to go through the errors and omissions process? Is it at the script development process or is greenlit to go into production? That has a lot to do with how much money you have, to be honest. I have been engaged by even literary producers to do errors and omissions clearance just on the book. That's much more rare. Most book publishers don't want to go through that expense or do it. But for sure, it's going to be a clause in any film distribution agreement or broadcasting agreement for the final product. And what, as a writer, you have to live with is if you don't do it early, and I respect that you may not want to, you're going to be facing that issue. And sometimes, sadly, and I don't like doing this, I'm a creative person on the music side, as I was introduced, and I don't like anything I create being changed, but you have to live with the fact that if you don't meet E&O requirements for clearance, you will experience changes in what your stories are, in the names of your subjects, or even entire sections about real life people that you can't print because we are finding that what you made up could attract a defamation lawsuit, for example. And this is the important thing. Errors and omissions insurers aren't looking for the standard of can I get away with this if a lawsuit arises. They want the lawyers to tell them there's virtually no chance of a lawsuit. And that's an entirely different standard. And that's I often have to explain that to clients that aren't aware that it's not going to be a legal risk at all standard that I have to meet, because they don't want to pay the legal fees to go to court just to win. They don't even want to hear about the lawsuit.
Right. So let's take that and let's do our favorite thing and walk through a problem, because we have so many people from different aspects here. So imagine that I'm a film director and I've optioned a book and I've written a screenplay and the author is unhappy with the direction the movie is going towards. Maybe they're unhappy with, Shyam mentioned that things get cut sometimes, things just, the visual aspect is not suiting them. So how do we sort of collaborate through that in a way that allows everyone to sort of feel like their vision is being honored? Paige, how would you be looped in from the beginning?
Yeah.
Say it comes to you, Paige, and it says to you, hey, I'm feeling uncomfortable with the dailies or whatever it is that I'm seeing. Maybe it's just the final draft of the screenplay, but everybody else is really excited.
I'll tell you that should be a question that's already answered. Number one is, what did it say in the contract? what are the creative control clauses in the first place? A lot of directors, and I'm going to be honest, when I not even directors, production companies really, because mostly the production company hires the directors. So the production company, the producers will want me to draft a clause that maximizes their creative control, where the final say goes to the producer.
Sure.
Presumably, if Paige represents the optioner, meaning the person that owns the literary product, she's going to want to pull those back in the negotiation with me.
So walk me through that, Paige. What would that look like for you to sort of stand up for your author?
Yeah, well, I was going to piggyback off of something Jeff said earlier to say the author typically won't have a guarantee of final control. That's usually something that they have to give up in the course of optioning their literary material. And that's because there are so many people involved in adapting it. And usually there will be a big production company kind of at the top who will have the final say. And so that's why I think the creative conversation is important to have up front, to make sure there's mutual respect and trust. But the author also has to understand from the beginning that they are, by signing that contract, they are going to be giving certain rights up to another party. And they have to be comfortable with that, however it turns out. There are different things that we can negotiate up front. So if the author is involved as a consultant, and that way they get to have meaningful input along the way. But again, that usually it will be in the contract that there's no contractual obligation to actually use their input. But it is a way for the author to stay involved in the creative process a little bit. Or, if they want to have more control, then we'd have to negotiate for them to be an executive producer or a screenwriter of the adaptation.
And
so it really does come down to the contract and how we negotiated the author to be involved up front.
And is that, like, for the author, is that based on, experience with film, how many books they have under their belt, whether, like what kind of power or sway, I guess, they have?
Yeah, I think it will be easier to get an author on board as a screenwriter if they are bringing, experience and success in that medium. But for a lot of authors, it's also the most straightforward way for them to gain screenwriting experience if they don't have any prior. And so that totally just depends on the relationship and how open and willing the filmmaker is. I will say that nobody knows the world and characters of a novel or any kind of book better than the author. So I think that they can be really advantageous in the adaptation and creative process. But I also want authors to understand that if they are primarily book writers, this is a different medium, this is a different world. And I also think it can be advantageous for them to trust in the process and trust the filmmakers who this is their medium, and let them adapt the book for screen in the way that it needs to be, because their books tend to be much more interior, and screenwriters and adapters have to find a way of, making that more physical, find a way of putting that on screen. So there are going to be changes. Also potentially a 400-page novel needs to be turned into an hour-and-a-half long movie. So there are going to be ways the narrative needs to be restructured, needs to be cut in order to be a good film or a good TV show, which is different than being a good book.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that, sorry, please.
Just say that, sorry, I was just going to say that I think that basically, if you sign the option, you have very little rights, and I think you have to accept that going up front. And there's not really very much you can do. Why? Because no producer is going to sign an option that gives the writer control, unless you're J.K. Rowling. So I think you just have to accept that and go with it. I think that all the times Funny Boy was adapted, I just accepted that was a reality. And I think that my agent was very clear about it, which is also nice, like basically this is what you're doing. And you should know it before you sign this. So I think that's good for an agent to be able to say something like that, should be telling the author that very clearly to start with. And the other thing that you should know as a novelist is that there's a form to a screenplay or a teleplay, or if your book gets adapted to a series, and that the book has to be sort of, I just say, dashed on the ground, and then you pick through the pieces and make the screenplay or the teleplay, because it's a different form. Like literally the arc of a screenplay or a teleplay, and teleplay is even more rigid. It's completely different from a novel. So you cannot have that expectation that your novel is going to be adapted cleanly for the screen. And some of the best adaptations that we've seen often are in the spirit of the novel rather than the novel itself. And I think that that's very clear to me, and it should be made clear, I think, to any fiction writer who's trying to, has had interest in adaptation.
Shyam, your comment about J.K. Rowling was interesting, because the truth is, even she is not exempt from this. She wanted a creative control clause, got a really excellent one compared to virtually every other writer in the world. And they first asked Steven Spielberg to be the director of the Harry Potter series, and he came back and said she has to waive that clause because I don't want the control. And she said no, and they lost Spielberg as the director. So that interplay with the director, because the producers are a different entity, is also important. As a writer, the more control you want to hang on to, you're going to affect the likelihood of getting a named director to be on your project, because the directors will say no.
Exactly. And I think also, you're absolutely right about that. And I think as a writer, even as a screenwriter, you have to accept the fact that the prime artist in a film is the director. It's not you. And the more you can get out of the director's way, the better the film is going to be, Like, I mean, with Funny Boy, I just went to see the filming for about a week. And I knew that was the limit. I just did not want to be in Deepa's face. I just wanted to give her the freedom to do it with all the feeling and emotion and everything she needed. So I think that's something else you have to accept.
So what was it about the screenplay? You mentioned that I think maybe the second pass that someone had taken, it kind of made you go, oh, this is not right. And so how do you navigate that feeling? Because there's a lot of shoulds in this business, right? Like you sign contracts that say things, but you still end up feeling a certain way about your work, right?
So I said to the person involved, I said, look, these are the reasons why I can't support this screenplay. However, I understand that I don't have any rights in this matter, but all I can tell you is that I'm not willing to do promo on the film. I'm not contractually allowed to diss the film,
right?
But I won't do promo on it. So I withdraw so that I can do. I can say I'm not doing any interviews on this. I can remain silent. I can pull myself out of it in that way. But that's about, I think, all the rights you have as an author.
Shasha, like coming in from your side, you co-directed this film. You have the writer in the text. You have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right? So how do you honor? Obviously you have a collaborative relationship with Catherine as well that extends beyond this film. So how do you ensure that your vision as a director is coming through while honoring the text? Or is it a thing where you're taking a hard hand and just saying like, I've got the book, I'm going to take what I need from it, and I'm going to make my movie?
I think that the goal should always, like if you're adapting a work, is to always honor the intention and honor, in our case, the lived experience that it came from. And you shouldn't be going into a project as an auteur director to be like driven by ego, to put your stamp on something. It should be like something that happens along the way, but always in service of honoring the text that it came from. Thankfully we had a creative collaboration with Catherine previously, so we kind of knew that we could trust one another. There's a fire alarm. So we, at the beginning, we were a bit of, there's a, I'll just let that pass.
Sure.
Now conducting a test of the fire alarm system.
Yes, it's good timing for it.
This kind of stuff. The bells might go off, but I'll just attempt to talk over it. Can you all hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, so at first we were afraid to have Catherine like on set all the time. We were like, oh, let's invite her on these specific days where everything is perfect. But over time, we began to realize that working very closely with her was to our benefit, and that eventually it became just like she would receive the call sheet and she would decide when she wanted to drop in or not. And she would constantly be rewriting things on the fly with us because the parameters of our project being a micro budget, there were consistent roadblocks that we had to overcome together. So we were really spoiled by having her as such a generous collaborator. And I'm worried that I will never meet a writer as generous as she is. But, she really understood what we were dealing with because she was there on set. She saw it. And additionally, her being from a theater background, she was used to not being precious with the material. And she gave us a lot of latitude. First of all, she knew how people would speak because having been a daycare provider, having been a theater performer, she knew how people would speak. But she also gave us the latitude to do a little bit of improv because she knew we were dealing with children and first-time actors. And so, yeah, it was a balance between honoring and respecting the original source text, but also having space to adapt as we went along together. Yeah.
One of the things you said that I loved, just I had to interject, was the word precious. I long time ago got taught by somebody who was a mentor that said, if you're dealing with creative works, make your work less precious and more valuable. And that's one of the things that I've learned my entire life that I just really felt motivated to share because that was really good.
So Jeff, what's an example of, say, you're going into a process, you think you have an airtight contract, but there are rumblings now between the author, the screenwriter, the director. When is an example of a lawyer needing to step in and sort of start flexing their muscles on an issue?
Well, my approach to all of that is literally to try to prevent that. Honestly, a good contract should have a lot of clarity and sensible dispute resolution mechanisms, and dispute resolution is entirely different than muscle flexing. I've long ago stepped away from litigation, not because I hadn't done it. I've been to the BC Court of Appeal. I've been to the Supreme Court of Canada. It was a world that I felt really is not conducive to what's a necessary collaborative process, which is making a film. The moment you get into litigation, and I've seen much of them, it's never going to fully get repaired. It's Humpty Dumpty falls and he's smashed everywhere. You can't put him back together again. And so really I believe very much in dispute resolution, in mechanisms where that doesn't happen. And to me, it really has to happen before the disputes start. You have to anticipate and talk about how you will resolve disputes before any of that stuff starts. I find it's really completely doable if we get involved in negotiating things in advance. And my comment to many clients is, the difference between what you spend to try to get a good agreement with people experience in putting a deal together versus not doing it and going to court or litigating is not a difference of doubling the money. It's really more of a difference of 10 to 20 times the amount of money. I dealt with a film one of the most significant one where the producer literally did not do any paperwork, and that ended up where both sides spent close to $80,000 in litigation only to settle at terms that would have been natural in the contract. So between two parties, $160,000 later that could have gone into the movie. It all went to lawyers, and I wasn't one of them. I was consulting, but I'm not a litigator anymore, and I just saw the whole thing as really such a waste and unnecessary. My entire fee for that film to have papered it right probably would have been under $30,000 in comparison. I'm talking every piece of paper, E&O, every legal thing you could have asked for would have been well under, even HST or GST would have been under that number, and yet the party spent an aggregate of 160,000.
So we're going to move to the Q&A in a couple of minutes. So I just wanted to ask, both Scarborough and Funny Boy had these sort of pre-existing reputations before they were moving towards film. What was that like for you guys to manage that adaptation? Were you conscious of that? Shyam, I know you wrote in the Globe piece about, you viewed it as an expansion of your vision. You were bringing something to the world. And one thing I'm curious about is there's this sense that a novel's ultimate metric for success is being made into a film, right? Their novel is not enough as a novel. It needs to be made into something more, primarily because film is so accessible. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I've been a novelist for a long time now, and I'm telling you, the novel, if it's good, will outlast the film for sure. So yes, it might give it a little bit more of it certainly gives you more of a push. It certainly gives you as a novelist the kind of money you couldn't have got anywhere else. But ultimately, the book, if it's if Funny Boy, it's been published in 1994, and it's still being read, and it's still being reprinted. So that to me is the way a novel lasts. A novel lasts. It finds readers over and over again if it's got something about it. So I just didn't miss my novel. It's an old novel. I don't even think it's my best novel. So I wasn't feeling very precious about it at all. I just knew that this was kind of a fun way to do something as a midlife, mid-career author, to try something different. So I think I approached it with a lot of playfulness and a lot of curiosity about this form about which I knew nothing, and not so much reverence, but respect for the great screenwriters who have come before, and seeing what as I did with the great novelists that have come before, see what I could borrow or steal from them.
And Shasha was, adapting a book that has a reputation, adapting a book of a collaborator. Was there a sense of pressure coming with that?
Yeah, I mean, there was immense pressure, for so many different reasons. And I think, thinking about the audience and interrogating like who is the audience and interrogating what am I bringing to the table, those are all things you do before you accept a project, before you decide to embark on it. And, building and engaging the audience throughout the process was something that we were able to successfully do, but only because we had incredible team members. So, as creators, as filmmakers, we really think deeply about the audience and accessibility, like before we began the process. And we had like Kenya Jade Pinto, who's our associate producer. She's like a social media wizard, and she actually carried the baton throughout production because I really believe that as a creative, as a director, you have to make space to actually focus on story first. And you can't be taking every single step of the way, worrying about like, what are people going to say on Twitter if we make this choice about this clothing? Like, no, you can't do that. So ultimately, you have to think about these things at the beginning stage. It will inform every decision you make, but I firmly believe it's important to have team members that do the audience engagement throughout production for you. And one of the things we did on this project, kind of carrying from our documentary background, was that we had community partners on board the film before it began production. And, we had an impact producer, Shireen Barsoom. So we had a really strong relationship with these NGOs who would give us support, and in turn, we would then make sure that the film was available to them for free to support their work when it was done. So yeah, like I think it's important to think about these things and set them in motion in the beginning. But if you're a director, you ultimately have to be able to hand the baton over to someone else, because you can't be doing all of those things throughout production.
Yeah. So just being mindful of time, I'm going to move to the Q&A now. So guys, just please remember to just enter your questions in the little Q&A box. Paige, first one I think is applicable to you. Typically, how long do rights last? So if someone is signing over, is it in perpetuity? Is it a year? Is it 5 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two parts typically to rights agreement when we're optioning the film and TV rights to IP. And so there's the option part, and there's no actual transfer of rights at that point. You're basically granting the filmmaker or the optioning party the exclusive right to develop and try to secure funding and financing and set that production up for success. And then there's the purchase agreement. So usually those are executed at the same time. Sometimes there's two separate agreements, sometimes they're folded in together, but they're two distinct parts. And so the purchasing agreement is when the actual transfer of rights happens. And usually that formally happens when cameras start rolling. So the contract language is upon commencement principal photography, but there's so many pieces that have to come into place in order to actually get something into production. So it's when that actually happens that the rights transfer. And so to answer the question, an option, again, those are up for negotiation. I think that the standard is usually option periods of 12 months. We don't like to do more than 3 option periods upfront at a time because 3 years I think is a good chunk of time for a filmmaker to have with the work to see if they can get it off the ground. Of course, if they're close to maybe closing a deal at the end of that 3rd term, then we can talk about renewing. But at that point, we can renegotiate terms. And then if the rights are purchased, usually that's in perpetuity, but we will build in reversion mechanisms. So there's a whole bunch of ways that rights might be able to revert to the author after a certain period of time. If they trigger the purchase of rights before production and nothing actually gets produced, for example, within a few years, then those rights would revert. So option periods usually in increments of 12 to 18 months. And then if the rights are purchased, that they usually get a more extended period of time to actually make the production, like five-ish years. So it just kind of depends.
Okay, Jeff?
The thing that you have to also keep in mind is there are certain funding agencies that if your option isn't long enough, usually a minimum of 2 years when you add up all the renewals of options, then they will not fund you. So if you're planning to build your budget, make sure that the option you secure matches what's required in the funding source that you want to get the money from. And then the other items that you have to think about are you going to include prequels, sequels, spin-offs? Page one, am I missing? Prequels, sequels, spin-offs, other things inspired by. I don't have the exact language in front of me.
Yeah.
So I got another question from, and I think this could be for anybody. Anyone can chime in for this one. This person, Sisley, is an author and a filmmaker. They have a self-published YA novel that they would like to turn into a screenplay. Should they write the screenplay first or send the book to an agent to see if they would find a producer? The other thing, Shasha, I would love to hear is from your director's perspective, would you want to come in at the ground level or would you rather come in with a screenplay ready to rock? So whoever thinks they have something for that, please go ahead, take the floor.
Well, I can speak. I feel like the first question is almost more of a publishing question, like whether they should send a self-published YA novel to an agent. And I will say, if you do that, you want to be able to demonstrate sales. It can be really hard for a publishing company, a publishing house, to take a self-published novel on board if it's already out in the world but doesn't have a demonstrated market, if it hasn't been selling. So unless you have significant sales of your self-published book, it might be better to just kind of take a crack at writing the screenplay yourself. I think either way, it's going to be a challenging path forward, but trying to set it up maybe directly with a filmmaker might be more straightforward. Certainly, if they were interested in getting it traditionally published, or I suppose an agent could take it on as a self-published book with the sole intention of taking it out to potential filmmakers. But again, I think it's going to be hard unless you have the demonstrated sales to back it up.
And Shasha, what's your perspective on that? Would you want someone to present you with a screenplay, or would you much rather be, as part of your process, would you much rather be involved from the ground level?
I guess it really depends on the project. Having just co-written my first screenplay with my partner Rich, I will say it's a lot of work, and so therefore it should only, I would only be interested in doing that if it was paid work, because it's a lot of work. Yeah, I would say it really depends on the project. But in this case, it's a question from someone who's, I'm guessing, is a first-time screenwriter. It's again a lot of work to put in upfront for something that a director or a producer might want to redo anyway. So I feel like it's probably a better use of their time to get those partners in place first. Yeah.
Okay. So another question we have, a legal question. Someone in the chat wanted to ask about adapting a book in the public domain, but with living heirs. Would there be legal repercussions if the writer took poetic license or embellished the original material?
So my first thing is, are you sure something is in the public domain? Because you're dealing with many different countries, different length of copyright, and there are so many different rules on what really is in the public domain. Most people get it wrong. Most young law students get it wrong. Most non-entertainment lawyers that understand copyright get it wrong. That is the ultimate truth. For example, in Canada, a literary work falls into the public domain only after the death of the last remaining author, and then you have to count to the end of the calendar year in which that happens, and it's 50 years after that doesn't start running until that moment. So is this book really in the public domain? And those years extend to 70 years or more, depending once again on what you do. So be very careful when you say public domain. It may not be, you know, the fact that it is. So that's number one. Second is, if there are living heirs, the question is, what are the heirs connected to? Are the heirs heirs to the copyright to the literary work, or are those heirs simply people who are related to the people or persons in the book? If the people or persons in the book who are the subject of the book are not part of the copyright ownership of the book, then you're not dealing with copyright, you're dealing with a concept called rights of publicity, privacy, and personality. And those rights are not controlled by federal copyright law. Those rights are controlled by individual laws of each province or state. So then you have to take a look. For example, New York has different rights of publicity, personality, and privacy compared to California. And you have states like Tennessee, which, because of the estate of Elvis Presley, they actually extended it in perpetuity. So until you know all of these things, you can't actually get the correct answer for that, because the way the question's framed opens up a lot of potential legal traps. So love the question, but we need more detail.
So they should talk to a lawyer, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is these are really gigantic, minefields for lawyers that don't know. And it really, you have to understand entertainment, because even a copyright lawyer would only know the portions related to the literary work, not the rest of the publicity and privacy issues.
Okay, so just gonna do a couple more questions. What are the differences between doing a traditional book adaptation deal versus some of the new media adaptations like Twitter threads, so the movie Zola that came out, I believe, last year, or Instagram pages, such as My Therapist Says?
I don't want to hog this, but I can tell
Paige,
you that
for you, that might be something you would have handled or might handle one day in the future.
Possibly, if one of our authors' Twitter threads gets optioned, but Jeff might be able to speak to it a bit better from direct experience.
It honestly depends on ownership. It really does, because there's been cases that have come out recently with Instagram where the terms of use of the Instagram page actually says that Instagram takes a right to relicense what you post without getting your permission again. And those have helped out, but only in certain courts in America, in certain circuits, and other circuits have disagreed. So you again have to look one step deeper into what we call a chain of title. I do an Instagram feed, I say stuff, those are literary works, but if my terms of use says Instagram could relicense that without my permission, which they have done for artists, who then could take those pictures and do things with it. And then in American law, that's apparently a transformative use, creating a new copyright. Now you're into all sorts of things that are very complex, and it's not as easy to regulate. On the other hand, a book, a literary work, a script, that chain of title is very easy to control, and there's a traditional series of paperwork that controls it.
So just before I throw it back to Rhiannon, Shyam, I want to ask you a question. Would you feel comfortable adapting someone else's novel now to screen? And do you think that your Funny Boy experience has helped that?
Yeah, I'd love to. If I really love the novel, I mean, I'd have to find a way to enter it in a way that felt personal. So yes, I'd love to do that, but it can't be anything. And it also, I mean, now I'm 57, right? So every time I've only got about 5 novels left in me. So everything is always kind of, now at this point, everything is sort of evaluated in that sense, like, I mean, I want to write these, whatever remaining novels I have before I'm too old to write. So, and novels take a long time to write. So that would always be my priority. So it would have to be something that truly excited me. But yeah, I mean,
so you're not a
some things
mercenary yet for the film world.
Say that again.
You're not a film mercenary yet for screenwriting, like the old guys, like Faulkner and Hemingway, who would just go to Hollywood and just write screenplays.
Well, I mean, they have like a salary, right? Like, I mean,
That's true.
we don't have that anymore. I mean, it's really, you're taking a huge chance here. I mean, you go in with so much faith into making a film. You really have to make sacrifices. A lot of things have to be sacrificed. I just think that, yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I mean, I do. I've done other adaptations of my own work, but it's just hard to. I mean, I've done one for The Hungry Ghosts, a limited TV series with Susan Coyne. But it's interesting because if you're doing a novel and it's any good, it gets published. But you can write something that's good as a screenwriter and nothing happens with it because the moment isn't correct. Or whatever, there's a whole bunch of things that happen around it. So yeah, I'm aware of that. I mean, I'm aware of that fact as well about film, being a novelist versus being a screenwriter, is that a lot of good stuff you do as a screenwriter never sees the light of day. But as a novelist, if you do something good, it will get published.
Just want to thank you guys so much for your time. This was a super interesting conversation. And thank you everyone in the chat for your questions. I think we will pass it back to Rhiannon now.
A huge thank you to Shasha, Paige, Jeff, Shyam, and Adnan for joining us and speaking today. And another thank you to our partners at the City of Toronto for presenting this session.